On September 19th, 1957, inside a rented building on Charleston Road in Palo Alto, Robert Noyce signed his name to the papers that created Fairchild Semiconductor. 8 men had walked out of William Shockley's laboratory the day before. They had no factory, no products, and no customers. What they carried instead was a method for building silicon transistors that none of their backers fully understood. In the weeks before that signature, the same men had sealed their agreement to each other in a stranger way. Each of the 8, along with 2 New York bankers, had signed his name across the face of 10 crisp $1 bills. Those bills were the only contract binding them together, because nobody in the group owned a share of anything yet. $10, signed 10 times, stood in for trust. The company those signatures launched would become the second largest semiconductor maker in the United States within a decade. It would also be hollowed out from the inside before that decade ended. This is the story of how Fairchild created Silicon Valley by failing to hold on to the one thing it actually owned, which was its people. You knew the smell of the diffusion furnaces before you knew anything else. If you worked the line at Mountain View in the early 1960s, you remember the heat coming off the quartz tubes, the hydrogen hiss, and the way a botched run could turn a whole boat of wafers into scrap. You wore no clean room suit of the kind that came later. Your hands did the work with tweezers and microscopes, placing tiny rectangles of silicon under probes and watching a needle swing when a junction held. Yield was the word that ran your day. Out of a wafer that should have produced dozens of good transistors, you might keep a handful, and the rest went into the reject tray without ceremony. You learned the planar process not from a manual, but from the person at the next bench, because the manual did not exist. That knowledge lived in your fingers and in the quiet adjustments you made that nobody had written down. When a salesman promised a customer a part that did not exist yet, you were the reason it shipped anyway. Working devices per shift measured your worth, and you knew exactly which of your coworkers could coax a stubborn batch into life. Management flew in from New York once a year. They walked the floor in suits that cost more than your monthly check, nodded at the figures, and flew home again. None of them knew your name. They also did not know that the value of the entire enterprise was sitting in the heads of the people they had just walked past. You knew it. Everyone on the floor knew it. The men in Syosset, New York, who controlled the company through a voting trust, treated the plant as a supplier of profit rather than a source of anything irreplaceable. That misreading would cost them everything, though the bill took years to arrive. Consider what Fairchild had built by the middle of the 1960s. The first product, a Mesa transistor designed by Gordon Moore, sold its opening batch of 100 units to IBM in 1958 at $150 apiece, destined for a bomber navigation computer. More transistors went to Autonet X for the guidance system of the Minuteman missile. Then came Jean Herné's planar process in 1959, which buried the fragile junction under a protective layer of glass and turned transistor making from a craft into something closer to printing. Robert Noyce saw that the same flat surface allowed many components to be wired together on a single chip, and the integrated circuit followed. By the end of 1961, the company was the largest producer of high-performance silicon transistors in the country. Revenue tells the rest. Annual sales climbed from roughly $1 million in 1958 to more than $130 million by 1966, which placed Fairchild second only to Texas Instruments. The semiconductor division generated 2/3 of the parent company's total sales. During 1965, the stock rose faster than any other issue on the New York Exchange, climbing from 27 to 144. With a 50-point jump in October alone. Product breadth matched the financial run. A young designer named Bob Widlar built the first widely used analog integrated circuit, the 709 amplifier, in 1965, and opened an entire market for analog parts. The 930 series of digital logic introduced in the mid-1960s became a default building block for computer designers and was widely copied across the industry. Fairchild controlled more than 30% of the market for integrated circuits at its peak. The space program became a major buyer. and by 1969, the Apollo effort had purchased around 1 million silicon chips, a large share of them from Fairchild. A factory on the Navajo Nation at Shiprock, New Mexico, opened in 1965 and grew to employ more than 1,000 workers, most of them women. Outside observers compared the company's pull on talent and capital to what Google would exert 4 decades later. Few firms in American history had risen so far so fast. Where did the money actually come from? And where did it go? Fairchild Semiconductor was never an independent business in the way its engineers imagined. The operation was a division of Fairchild Camera and Instrument, an East Coast conglomerate with deep military contracts. And that parent had loaned the founders $1,380,000 to start. That loan carried a clause that mattered more than any technical specification. A buyout option sat inside it, letting the parent acquire the founders entirely for $3 million. And in 1959, with sales surging, the parent exercised it. Each of the 8 received roughly $250,000 and, in the same stroke, surrendered ownership of the company they had built. Those 10 signed dollar bills that had sealed their partnership were keepsakes now because real ownership had moved east. From that point forward, the people generating the profit held salaries and little else. Margins were extraordinary for the era because a planar transistor that cost a few dollars to make could sell for many times that to a defense contractor with no alternative. As late as 1959, 4/5 of the division's business came from military customers, with the remaining fifth commercial. Early integrated circuits reached the market in 1961 at around $100 to $20 per chip, a price only a customer with a severe weight or space constraint would pay. The military and the space program were exactly those customers. Licensing added another stream, since the planar process was so far ahead that rival firms paid to copy it. And Herne's 2 N1613 transistor was designed into products across the industry. The company also marketed with unusual aggression for a parts supplier. On October 10, 1967, Fairchild bought airtime on 32 television stations to broadcast a half-hour briefing on integrated circuits, among the first technology infomercials ever aired. Profit flowed upward to Psi-OSS-ET, where the chief executive, John Carter, directed it into acquisitions of unrelated and often unprofitable companies. The engineers in California watched the cash they generated leave the state to fund ventures they considered beneath them. Compensation in the semiconductor division included far fewer stock options than other parts of the parent company received. The men who held the knowledge held no meaningful stake in the upside of the thing they were creating. That single arrangement, more than any product decision, set the ending in motion. The usual explanation for Fairchild's decline is mismanagement, and that explanation is not wrong so much as shallow. People point to John Carter draining profits for bad acquisitions. They point to the board's refusal to promote noise when the top job came open. Critics point to the company losing the digital logic market to Texas Instruments, whose faster TTL family overtook Fairchild's older DTL designs by the end of the decade. Each of those things happened. None of them reaches the actual mechanism because each treats the decline as a series of avoidable errors rather than a structural inevitability. Here's the deeper argument. In the semiconductor industry of that period, durable advantage did not live in any patent, and it did not live in any single product. The planar patent was cross-licensed across the industry within a few years. Any given chip design was copied or surpassed within a product cycle or two. The one thing that could not be copied was the accumulated process knowledge held by the engineers and line workers who had learned, through thousands of failed runs, how to make silicon behave. That knowledge was the real asset, and it was an asset that walked out of the building every evening on 2 legs. A company could bind that asset to itself only through ownership, by giving the people who held the knowledge a genuine stake in the enterprise they were building. Equity was the instrument that converted a loyalty into wealth and wealth into staying. Fairchild's structure made that instrument impossible. The parent in New York owned the company outright, captured the profits, and offered the California engineers salaries rather than meaningful shares. So the value Fairchild created could never be retained by Fairchild because the corporation owned the factories and the patents while holding no claim on the loyalty of the people who mattered. Consider how the older California firms had handled the same question. Companies like Beckman and Varian, built in the 1940s and 50s, distrusted Wall Street and kept ownership tightly held for decades. The new firms of the 1960s were created on the opposite premise, structured for an early public offering that would turn engineers into owners within a few years. Fairchild sat on the wrong side of that divide, governed by an East Coast parent that thought like the old world while sitting on top of the new one. The value did not vanish when the engineers grew restless. It migrated. The knowledge walked across town, often no farther than the wagon wheel bar where the Valley's engineers traded news over beer, and it reassembled itself inside new companies built specifically around the promise that the people doing the work would own a piece of the result. Fairchild functioned in the end as an involuntary academy. The firm trained the most capable semiconductor talent in the world and then, lacking any means to keep them, released that talent into a region hungry to fund exactly such people. By 1966, the parent had only about 2.5 million shares outstanding, and it treated the semiconductor division as a pool of cash to be spent elsewhere rather than an asset to be reinvested. Knowledge of this kind transfers in only one way, through the movement of the people who hold it. When those people leave, the method leaves intact and arrives at a competitor the following Monday. The commonly cited mismanagement was real, yet mismanagement is what you call a structural flaw after the fact. Structure was the cause. From that failure, the Valley drew an exact and inverted lesson. Build the company so that the people who create the value also capture it, and they will stay to compound it. A subsidiary cannot keep what it cannot own, and a Fairchild could not own its people. The unraveling moved fast once it began. In October 1967, an industry downturn combined with the loss of logic market share, and the semiconductor division lost money for the first time since its earliest months. Charlie Spork, the operations manager who ran the tightest factory in the business, had already left in March of that year to become president of National Semiconductor, taking a group of senior Fairchild people with him and gaining a real stake in his new company. Don Valentine, the marketing leader who would later found the venture firm Sequoia Capital, departed in the same period and joined Spork. The talks that pulled Spork away had earlier stalled with a British firm over, of all things, stock options. That pattern was unmistakable to everyone except the men in New York. During 1968, passed over for the top job a final time, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore resigned to start their own company. Their banker was Arthur Rock, the same financier who had arranged the original Fairchild deal, and he raised the money for Intel, largely on the strength of their names, and a structure that gave founders and early employees real ownership. Jerry Sanders, a Fairchild sales executive, was pushed out the same year and founded Advanced Micro Devices in 1969. Departures arrived in two distinct waves. The first ran from 1961 to 1963, organized around the planar process and the integrated circuit. A second wave ran from 1968 to 1969, organized around large-scale integration. Julius Blank, the last of the original 8 to remain, left in 1969, and the drain that had powered the company's growth was complete. To stop the bleeding, the parent installed a new chief executive, C. Lester Hogan, lured from Motorola, along with around 60 of his own people, in a raid so brazen that Motorola sued. The case dragged on until 1973, when Judge William Koppel ruled that Fairchild's results had been so unimpressive that no damages could even be calculated. Hogan moved headquarters west and kept the technology advancing, including early semiconductor memory and the charge-coupled imaging device that sits behind modern cameras. Ventures into consumer products under the new regime, including digital watches and early video games, mostly failed to find footing. Even the Silicon Gate process that would define the next generation of chips slipped away, carried to Intel by the engineer Federico Fa Jean, who had developed it inside Fairchild's own laboratory and designed the 3708. the first commercial MOS integrated circuit using that method. Revenue grew again under Hogan, yet the company never recovered its lead. Every escaping engineer became a competitor, and each one carried the irreplaceable knowledge that the parent had never found a way to keep. What survived is almost everything, though little of it carried the Fairchild name. The planar process John Hironi sketched in his notebook in late 1957 remains the fundamental structure underneath every chip manufactured today, from the simplest controller to processors holding tens of billions of transistors. Moore's observation in 1965 about the steady doubling of components became the yardstick the entire industry set its pace against. The deeper legacy is institutional rather than technical. Companies grown from departed Fairchild employees, known as the Fairchildren, came to number in the dozens, and a family tree assembled by the Computer History Museum traces a remarkable share of the semiconductor industry back to that one Charleston Road building. Intel, Advanced Micro Devices, National Semiconductor, Intersil, and LSI Logic all descend from Fairchild alumni. The venture capital that funded them traces back there too. Eugene Kleiner, one of the original 8, left in 1961 and later co-founded Kleiner Perkins. Don Valentine built Sequoia Capital. Arthur Rock, who handled the founding transaction, became the model for the West Coast venture capitalist. The single most important habit those people carried out of Fairchild was the one Fairchild itself never practiced, which was giving employees ownership. Broad stock option grants became the organizing principle of every startup that followed, the standing correction to the flaw that had emptied the company. A journalist named Don Hopfler popularized the name Silicon Valley in 1971 to describe the region they had built. As for the company itself, the parent sold the division to Schlumberger in 1979, and National Semiconductor bought it in 1987, run by the same Fairchildren who had left 2 decades earlier. The South Portland, Maine plant that came with the company kept running for decades as one of the longest continuously operating semiconductor fabs in the world. National spun Fairchild backs out as an independent firm in 1997. The name finally disappeared in 2016 when On Semiconductor absorbed what remained for $2.4 billion. That Charleston Road site had been named California Historical Landmark No. 1000 back in 1991. A Fairchild advertisement from the era showed the logos of its offspring under 3 blunt words. We started it all. Those 10 $1 bills, each signed 10 times, were a contract written on currency because the 8 founders had nothing else to pledge to one another. The company they built ran afterward on a different kind of paper, the stock certificate, and the men in New York never grasped that this was the only paper that could have held it together. If you ever signed a startup offer letter and read the line granting you options, you were holding the lesson Fairchild taught by losing everything. Subscribe to watch how the rest of Silicon Valley learned it.